Let's not sugarcoat this. The organized crime, the cartel, struck those who gave orders above the three branches of government. Today, the message to Mexico is painfully clear.
That statement dropped right after a shocking moment. A mayor celebrating Day of the Dead with his family got gunned down in front of everyone. But this wasn't some random cartel hit. This was a clear message, and it was meant for the US, because just days before his death, that mayor did something no one else dared to do. He said no. The man who said no. The videos started circulating within minutes. Shaky phone footage captured from behind concrete pillars and parked cars. People screaming. The sound of gunfire puncturing what should have been a peaceful evening of remembrance. In the chaos, you could see a man in a white shirt being dragged, security personnel scrambling, crowds fleeing in every direction. By the time the sun rose on November 2nd, Carlos Alberto Manzo Rodriguez, the 42-year-old mayor of Uruapan, Michoacán, was dead, shot 7 times at close range while attending a candlelight vigil for Day of the Dead. Uruapan isn't some remote village nobody's heard of. It's a city of roughly 350,000 people, sitting right in the heart of Mexico's so-called avocado belt. If you've eaten guacamole in the United States recently, there's a decent chance those avocados came from this region. It's an agricultural powerhouse that generates billions in exports to America every single year. But underneath that legitimate economy runs something far darker. Uruapan has become one of Mexico's most violent cities, a battleground where cartels like the Jalisco New Generation Cartel and remnants of the Knights Templar fight viciously for control of drug routes, extortion rackets, and the incredibly lucrative avocado trade itself. Carlos Manzo knew exactly what kind of war zone he was stepping into when he ran for mayor. He wasn't some naive politician promising empty reforms. This man had previously been a member of President Claudia Sheinbaum's Morena party before breaking away to run as an independent in 2024. He won his election on a platform that was crystal clear: reclaim Uruapan from cartel influence, no matter the cost. People started calling him the Mexican Bukele, comparing him to El Salvador's president, Nayib Bukele, who'd taken an iron-fisted approach against gangs in his own country. Manzo didn't just talk tough for the cameras. He meant every word. In a speech back in May of 2025, he laid out his philosophy in terms that couldn't be misunderstood. If someone is opening fire on the civilian population, we are going to take them down. And if that's a crime, then we'll defend ourselves in court, or we'll pay the price in prison. Those weren't the words of a politician hedging his bets or playing it safe. Those were the words of a man who understood he was painting a target on his own back and decided to do it anyway. And he backed up that rhetoric with action. Manzo led joint operations with federal forces that seized over 50 armored vehicles, the kind drug traffickers call monster trucks, 840 explosive devices, and dozens of firearms. He went public with discoveries of mass graves. He exposed cartel training camps. He called out the extortion schemes that had farmers and business owners living in constant fear, paying protection money just to stay alive. Every single one of these actions made him more enemies among people who don't forgive and don't forget. The thing is, Manzo wasn't stupid. He knew what he was up against. He knew the history. Michoacán had already seen 6 other mayors assassinated since 2022. He watched as a prominent lime grower was killed in October of 2025 after speaking out against extortion. He saw a journalist shot dead in 2024 after interviewing him. The writing wasn't just on the wall. It was written in blood across his entire state. So Manzo did what any reasonable person would do in that situation. He begged for help, not quietly, not through back channels, but publicly and desperately. In September of 2025, just 2 months before his death, he gave a radio interview where he said these words: "We need greater determination from the President of Mexico. I do not want to be just another mayor on the list of those who have been executed. I am very afraid, but I must face it with courage." Read that again. A sitting mayor on public radio saying he was very afraid of being executed, asking the president of his country for help. This wasn't wasn't some private memo that got leaked. This was a public plea broadcast to anyone who would listen. He essentially stood up and said, "I know they are going to try to kill me. Please send help before they succeed." The help never came, not in any meaningful way at least. Manzo had a security detail consisting of 14 National Guard members and municipal officers for a man who'd made himself enemy number one to multiple cartels, who'd been seizing their weapons and exposing their operations, who'd been publicly calling out the government's soft approach. 14 guards. And on the night of November 1st, even those 14 weren't enough. The attack was brazen in a way that still sends chills when you really think about it. This wasn't some ambush on a lonely road at 3 in the morning. This was 8 p.m. on Day of the Dead during a public candlelight ceremony, with Manzo's family standing right there beside him, with his security detail surrounding him. In a crowded public square full of witnesses with cameras, security experts described it as a kamikaze-style operation because of its suicidal intensity, the kind of hit where the attackers know they're probably not making it out alive and they do it anyway. The gunman approached and opened fire. He shot Manzo 7 times at close range. Security forces returned fire, killing the shooter almost immediately. 2 more suspects were arrested nearby, but by then, it was too late. Manzo died shortly after arriving at the hospital, becoming the 150th government official murdered in Mexico in 2025 alone. 150 government officials in less than a year. Let that sink in for a moment. Michoacán Governor Alfredo Ramirez Bedolla confirmed the details on social media. Security Minister Omar Garcia Harfuch made the standard promise that comes after every one of these killings. There will be no impunity. But anyone paying attention knows that promise is hollow. No official motive was stated, but everyone from authorities to security experts to ordinary citizens understood exactly why this happened. Cartels were retaliating against Manzo for disrupting their extortion networks, for making their operations harder, for refusing to play along with the system that allows them to operate with near complete impunity. And here's where the story takes an even darker turn, because there's evidence suggesting the hit cost the cartels roughly 50,000 pesos. That's about $2,700 US. $2,700 to murder a sitting mayor who had a federal security detail in the middle of a crowded public event. Think about what that price tag tells you. It tells you that killing government officials in Mexico has become so routine, so normalized, that it's essentially a commodity with market rates. It tells you that finding people willing to carry out these hits is as easy as posting a job listing. It tells you that the cartels have so thoroughly infiltrated the system that they can operate with confidence that even the most brazen murders will ultimately go unpunished. President Claudia Sheinbaum, who'd been in office for just about a month at this point, convened an emergency security cabinet meeting on November 2nd. She condemned the killing as a vile act and an irreparable loss, pledging justice and vowing to strengthen anti-crime efforts in Michoacán. But those promises rang pretty hollow to a lot of people, especially given that Sheinbaum has continued the hugs not bullets policy, abrazos no balazos, started by her predecessor, Andrés Manuel López Obrador. This policy emphasizes social programs and intelligence gathering over direct military confrontation with cartels. Manzo himself had publicly challenged this approach. He'd argued that soft policies weren't stopping the violence that has claimed over 180,000 lives since 2006, and now he was dead, proving his point in the most tragic way possible.
Now the government calls for an urgent meeting. For what? To repeat the same script we know by heart? We regret the events. We are investigating right now. There will be no impunity, they say. But there were no urgent meetings before, when mothers of the disappeared were begging for help.
The online reaction was swift and brutal. Social media platforms, particularly X, erupted with outrage. Users called Manzo a hero, overrun by cartels. One post captured the rage perfectly. He begged daily for more police. Instead, the sicarios were paid 50,000 pesos. Fuck cartels and fuck Claudia. We want justice. Hashtags like Justicia para Manzo, Justice for Manzo, started trending. Videos of the attack racked up millions of views as people tried to understand how something like this could happen in broad daylight, in a public square, to a man who'd literally predicted his own death and begged for protection. But Manzo's assassination, as horrific as it was, represents just one piece of a much larger and more disturbing puzzle that's been taking shape along the US-Mexico border. Banners and bounties. While Mexico was still reeling from the mayor's murder, American officials were dealing with something that had happened just weeks earlier, something that directly threatened United States citizens and had set off alarm bells all the way up to the highest levels of government. Between October 5th and 8th of 2025, narco banners appeared on bridges in Baja California Sur, specifically in the Los Cabos area, San Jose del Cabo, and Cabo San Lucas, two of the most popular tourist destinations for Americans in all of Mexico. These weren't your typical cartel messages threatening rival gangs or corrupt officials. These banners were addressed directly to the Mexican government, to U.S. officials, and most chillingly, to American citizens. The message was explicit and terrifying. The banners, attributed to La Chapiza faction of the Sinaloa cartel, that's the group led by the sons of Joaquin El Chapo Guzman, warned that Americans would be targeted starting October 5th. The exact wording read, "You will be the ones to blame. We'll show how we'll make this war starting 5/10/2025 on all Americans residing in areas where we have a presence, especially those living in San Jose del Cabo and Cabo San Lucas. We are the ones who rule here, and we'll demonstrate what we are capable of if you don't stop arresting our people and decommissioning our loads and weapons." Let's be clear about what this means. Los Cabos isn't some border town most Americans have never heard of. It's a premier tourist destination that draws 3.5 million U.S. visitors annually. These are places where Americans go for spring break, for destination weddings, for golf vacations, and the Sinaloa cartel just put up public messages saying they were going to start a war against Americans in these exact locations. The banners didn't just make vague threats either. They named names. They specifically called out Mexican President Claudia Sheinbaum, Security Minister Omar Garcia Harfuch, FBI Director Kash Patel, and DEA Administrator Terry Cole. This was the cartel essentially saying, "We know exactly who you are, we know what you're doing, and we're holding you personally responsible for what happens next." The timing wasn't coincidental. These threats came in direct response to escalating U.S. operations against cartel leadership. In July of 2024, Ismael El Mayo Zambada, one of the Sinaloa cartel's most powerful leaders, was arrested in a U.S. operation. That arrest sparked a 14-month internal war within the Sinaloa cartel as different factions fought for control. La Chapiza blamed U.S. intervention for destabilizing their organization and triggering this violent infighting. These banners were their way of saying enough is enough, keep coming after us, and we'll start hitting back where it hurts. Mexican officials tried to downplay the threats. They pointed out that 46 similar banners had appeared in Baja earlier in 2025, and that most turned out to be fear-mongering rather than actual operational plans. But even if the immediate threats didn't materialize into mass attacks on Americans, the message itself did tremendous damage. Tourism revenue took a hit. Travel advisories were updated. Americans planning vacations started reconsidering their destinations, and the psychological impact, knowing that a major cartel had explicitly threatened to target U.S. citizens, created a climate of fear that benefited nobody except the cartels themselves. This wasn't happening in a vacuum either. The Trump administration had taken an increasingly aggressive stance toward Mexican cartels. President Trump has made no secret of his intentions to go after these organizations with everything available to the U.S. government. Under his administration, there have been military strikes on suspected smuggling boats, including operations that killed 65 people in the Caribbean. He's threatened to designate cartels as foreign terrorist organizations, which would dramatically expand the legal tools available to target them. He's imposed tariffs and threatened more if Mexico doesn't do more to curb migration and fentanyl flows. The cartels noticed. A Sinaloa leader told the New York Times in March 2025, "For the first time in years, we fear arrest or death." That's a remarkable admission from organizations that have operated with near complete impunity for decades. The U.S. pressure was actually working, at least in terms of making cartel leadership nervous. But as we've seen throughout history, cornered animals are often the most dangerous. And that brings us back to Mayor Manzo's assassination. On the surface, it might seem like a purely internal Mexican affair, a local politician killed for opposing cartels on Mexican soil. But when you zoom out and look at the bigger picture, it takes on a much more sinister dimension. Uruapan, where Manzo was killed, isn't just some random city. It's in the heart of the avocado-growing region that exports billions of dollars worth of product to the United States every year. The cartels that killed Manzo control not just drug trafficking, but also extortion rackets targeting this legitimate agriculture industry industry that's deeply integrated with the U.S. economy. By killing Monzo in such a public, brazen way during a major holiday in front of witnesses, despite federal security, the cartels weren't just eliminating a troublesome mayor. They were sending a broader message about their operational impunity, effectively broadcasting their dominance to both Mexican authorities and the United States. They were saying, look, we can kill anyone, anywhere, anytime. We can do it in crowded public spaces. We can do it to people under federal protection. We can do it despite all your raids and arrests and tough talk. We still run this. The assassination happened just weeks after those narco banners threatening Americans. It occurred while U.S.-Mexico tensions over cartel violence were already at elevated levels. It came amid ongoing debates about U.S. military intervention in Mexico and whether cartels should be designated as terrorist organizations. The timing made it impossible to separate Monzo's murder from this broader context of cartels pushing back against American pressure. The American response was immediate and forceful, at least rhetorically. Deputy Secretary of State Christopher Landau condemned the assassination and posted a pre-attack photo of Monzo with his son. Landau stated that the United States stands ready to deepen security cooperation with Mexico to wipe out organized crime. Those words carry weight coming from a senior State Department official. They signal that the U.S. views this not just as an internal Mexican problem, but as something that directly affects American security interests. And it should affect those interests, because the threat has already reached American soil in ways that go beyond just rhetoric and banners. Intelligence reports from 2025 indicate that cartels, working in coordination with U.S.-based gangs like the Latin Kings in Chicago and even some domestic extremist groups, have implemented tiered bounty systems offering up to $50,000 for assassinations of ICE and CBP officers. $50,000. That's roughly 20 times what they allegedly paid to kill Mayor Monzo. Threats against U.S. law enforcement have surged 8,000% year over year. 8,000%. These aren't empty threats either. They involve ambushes, spotters in cities like Chicago and Portland, and drone surveillance originating from northern Sonora, Mexico. A specific alert from the Rio Grande Valley sector warned of coordinated attacks on Border Patrol agents, with cartels potentially offering $10,000 for shootings. Reports indicate that assailants may impersonate Mexican military personnel, wearing uniforms while armed with machine guns. This isn't some abstract geopolitical problem anymore. This is cartels actively recruiting people to kill American law enforcement officers on American soil. This is surveillance operations being run in U.S. cities. This is the same organizations that just killed a mayor in broad daylight in Mexico, now extending their reach across the border in increasingly aggressive ways. The drug trafficking itself continues unabated, even as border crossings have plummeted to historic lows under the Trump administration's aggressive policies. Illegal crossings dropped to 238,000 apprehensions in fiscal year 2025, the lowest since the 1970s. That sounds like a success story, and in some ways, it is. But the cartels have adapted. With fewer people crossing, they've pivoted to increasing fentanyl flows and setting up more domestic U.S. labs. Some projections suggest fentanyl trafficking could increase 20% as a direct response to border tariffs. The numbers are staggering. Mexico's Operation Northern Border has seized 467 kilograms of fentanyl and over 1 million rounds of ammunition since February. But that's just what they've caught. The cartels control vast territories south of the border and have sophisticated logistics networks that move drugs, weapons, and people across international boundaries with disturbing efficiency. And they're not just using traditional smuggling methods anymore. Cartels have deployed advanced technology, including drones like the DJI Matrice 30T that can drop explosives. They've been seen using these in states like Chihuahua and Sinaloa. They've erected narco banners in Mexicali, threatening government officials. They operate with a level of sophistication that rivals some national militaries. The economic dimension can't be ignored either. Cartels generate an estimated $50 billion annually, much of it flowing through remittance networks. The Trump administration's tariffs, including a 25% levy on Mexican imports that became effective November 1st, are partly aimed at disrupting this financial ecosystem. But tariffs cut both ways. They hurt legitimate trade and businesses, while cartels find workarounds. What we're seeing is a fundamental transformation in how cartels operate and how they view their relationship with the United States. For years, there was an unspoken understanding. Cartels operated primarily in Mexico, targeting Mexican officials and rival gangs, while avoiding direct confrontation with U.S. interests to prevent triggering overwhelming American military response. That calculation appears to be changing. When corners fight back. To understand why cartels are becoming more aggressive toward the United States, you have to understand just how deeply embedded they've become in Mexican society itself. Mexico is increasingly described by experts as a de facto failed state, with cartels controlling entire regions through a combination of violence, corruption, and economic power that rivals or exceeds government authority. Cartels routinely offer government officials salaries that are 10 times what they'd make working legitimately. When you're a police officer or a local politician making maybe $15,000 a year, and someone offers you $150,000 to look the other way, what do you do? Especially when turning down that offer might mean your family gets killed? The corruption isn't just about greed, though there's plenty of that. It's about survival in a system where the cartels have more money, more guns, and more reach than the government they're supposed to be subject to. 150 government officials murdered in 2025 alone. That number isn't just a statistic. Each one represents someone who made the decision to stand up, to try to do the right thing, to challenge the system, and each one paid with their life, often in brutal public ways designed to terrorize anyone else who might consider following their example. Manzo's Assassination exemplifies this perfect, showing exactly what happens when someone refuses to play along. The international implications ripple outward in ways most people don't fully appreciate. The United States has conducted 55 extraditions of cartel members through joint operations with Mexico, showing there is some level of cooperation between the governments. President Trump has invoked the International Emergency Economic Powers Act to impose tariffs, citing Mexico's failure to intercept drug traffickers and stop the flow of fentanyl. He's threatened more dramatic action, including potential airstrikes against cartel infrastructure inside Mexico. That last possibility, U.S. military action on Mexican soil, represents a geopolitical powder keg. Mexico jealously guards its sovereignty, and for good reason given the complicated history between the two nations. President Sheinbaum has emphasized bilateral cooperation, while resisting any suggestion that the U.S. might take unilateral military action. But as violence escalates, and as cartels become more brazen in threatening Americans, the pressure for some kind of dramatic U.S. response continues to build. Executive orders from the Trump administration have declared a national emergency at the border, authorizing military control of federal borderlands and giving the Department of Defense jurisdiction over certain territories. 2 months of what the administration calls decisive action have included ICE raids, FISA warrant expansions tracking 300 cartel operational nodes, and physical barriers like buoys in the Rio Grande. Secretary of State Marco Rubio has highlighted 7,900 arrests and joint training operations with Mexican counterparts. Public sentiment in the United States reflects deep frustration and growing calls for action. Social media discussions show people demanding everything from targeted military strikes to complete trade sanctions. One analysis noted that about 60 to 70% of Americans oppose full-scale military invasion, but support more targeted operations against cartel leadership and infrastructure. The challenge is figuring out what targeted operations actually look like when cartels are so thoroughly embedded in Mexican society. Online forums and discussion boards show similar patterns. People ask questions like, why doesn't the U.S. just roll up with tanks and eliminate the cartels? The answers usually involve detailed explanations of terrain challenges, the Hydra problem where eliminating one leader just spawns 3 more violent successors, the risk of civilian casualties, and the diplomatic nightmare of conducting military operations on Allied soil without permission. Veterans point out that even with overwhelming military superiority, guerrilla warfare and asymmetric tactics can bog down conventional forces for years, citing Vietnam, Iraq, and Afghanistan as cautionary tales. But perhaps the most disturbing aspect of all this is how it reflects a fundamental breakdown in the international order that's supposed to govern civilized behavior between nations. Mexico is supposed to be a friendly neighbor, a trading partner, an ally. The fact that criminal organizations operating from Mexican territory can openly threaten American citizens, put bounties on American law enforcement, and kill officials who cooperate with U.S. authorities represents a complete failure of the system that's supposed to prevent exactly these kinds of situations.
What happened to Carlos Manso? It is not an isolated incident. It is a message, a brutal reminder that in Mexico, the truth finds you and kills you. Yesterday, they did not just assassinate a mayor. They assassinated hope, they assassinated justice, and they assassinated the courage to speak.
The words in that clip capture something profound about what Manso's death represents. It wasn't just one man dying. It was the death of the idea that courage and integrity matter, that standing up to evil makes a difference, that the good guys can win if they just try hard enough. When someone publicly predicts they'll be killed for doing the right thing, begs for help, doesn't get it, and then gets killed exactly as they feared, what message does that send to everyone else? Expert analysis suggests we're at a potential inflection point. If the threats against Americans confirm with actual attacks, if cartels follow through on killing ICE or Border Patrol agents on U.S. soil, if they successfully target FBI or DEA officials, as those narco banners threatened, the entire calculation changes. At that point, it stops being about drug policy or border security or trade relations. It becomes about direct attacks on American sovereignty that demand a military response. Some projections suggest we could see 50 to 100 expatriate abductions by the fourth quarter of 2025 if current trends continue unchecked. That's Americans living in Mexico for retirement or business, suddenly finding themselves targeted simply because they're U.S. citizens. The ripple effects would extend far beyond those direct victims. Tourism would crater. Businesses with cross-border operations would face impossible security challenges. The bilateral relationship between the two countries would be tested in ways not seen in generations. And the avocado angle, believe it or not, matters more than you might think. Uruapan and the surrounding Michoacan region produce billions of dollars worth of avocados exported to the United States. The cartels have figured out they can extort this legitimate industry just as effectively as they traffic drugs. American consumers probably don't think about cartel violence when they're buying guacamole ingredients, but every avocado from that region comes with blood on it in some form. Either the farmer paid protection money, or they resisted and suffered consequences, or they're connected to people who cooperate with the cartels for survival. Intelligence monitoring via FISA warrants and joint U.S.-Mexican operations continues, tracking cartel movements and communications. This intelligence gathering is crucial because without it, the risk of violence spilling over into American cities becomes much higher. The cartels are sophisticated enough to hide among normal cross-border traffic, to use legitimate businesses as fronts, to communicate in ways that evade detection. Staying ahead of them requires constant vigilance and cooperation between agencies that don't always work well together. The humanitarian costs get lost sometimes in all the geopolitical discussion and security analysis. 181 Mexican migrants died in just the first 4 months of 2025, up from 81 in the same period of 2024. These are real people, often fleeing violence caused by the very cartels we're discussing, dying in deserts or rivers, or at the hands of smugglers who see them as nothing more than commodities. Guatemalans flee gang violence to Mexico as U.S. asylum processes tighten, only to find themselves trapped in another dangerous situation. The smuggling networks themselves have evolved dramatically. Cartels now charge upwards of $10,000 per migrant, blending legitimate asylum seekers with criminal elements in ways that make it nearly impossible to sort out who's who until they're already on American soil. This creates an impossible situation for Border Patrol and immigration officials trying to enforce laws cause, while also recognizing genuine humanitarian needs. Looking at all of this together, the mayor's assassination, the narco banners threatening Americans, the bounties on law enforcement, the drug trafficking, the corruption, the diplomatic tensions, the humanitarian crisis, you start to see not just individual problems, but a comprehensive challenge that doesn't have any easy answers. Every possible solution comes with serious drawbacks and unintended consequences. But what that change looks like, how it gets implemented, and who bears the costs remains the subject of intense debate, with no consensus in sight. What's not debatable is that the cartels have sent their message loud and clear. They're not afraid. They're not backing down. They're escalating, and Mayor Carlos Manzo's bullet-riddled body, lying in a Uruapan morgue after being killed at a peaceful ceremony with his son by his side, represents both a warning and a challenge to anyone, Mexican or American, who thinks they can stand up to this machinery of violence and corruption and win. The question now is whether that challenge gets answered, and if so, how. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this video, click on one of the suggested videos on your screen right now for more amazing content.